We had an agreement, written out on a single page of paper, dated April the 3rd, 1880, signed by both of us at Iris Webb's kitchen table with a pen that had run dry twice in the process and had to be refilled. No witnesses except ourselves, which was fine. We were the only parties to the contract, and we were both present. The terms were clear. Party of the first part, Iris Webb 80 acres, northeast section. To provide 2 meals per week, delivered to the fence line at the agreed hour, and to mend work clothing as items were presented, with a 2-week turnaround. Party of the second part, Caleb Morrison, 120 acres, north section. To maintain the shared fence line between properties, to perform heavy postwork as needed, and to service the well on the Webb property twice annually. Fair exchange. Both parties benefit. No ambiguity. I had drawn it up myself because I was better with paperwork than Cal, and because I had been drawing up my own documents since I was 19 years old and had learned that a thing not written was a thing not agreed. Thomas had taught me this, or rather the years after Thomas had confirmed it, that the only arrangements that survive difficulty are the ones with their terms established before the difficulty arrives. Thomas. I should say something about Thomas, because understanding where I came from mattered for understanding why I handled things the way I did. Thomas Webb had been the kind of man who believed in the legibility of arrangements, who thought that if something was worth doing, it was worth saying plainly, and if it was worth saying plainly, it was worth writing down. He had learned this the hard way in Georgia, where arrangements made without documentation had a way of disappearing when they became inconvenient to one party. We had both learned this. We had come north and then west carrying the lesson. He had been gone for 2.5 years by the time the arrangement with Cal began. I had spent those 2.5 years becoming very good at running the farm alone, not because I had no choice, but because I had made the choice and I was going to do it correctly. The farm was mine. The records were mine. The accounts were mine. I had made it work. What I had not done in 2.5 years was allow anything complicated to enter the picture. The arrangement with Cal was simple. I had written it down. I had signed it. I had been very careful to keep it exactly what it said it was. Thomas. I should say something about Thomas because he is the reason I came to Colorado, and because understanding what I had built before Cal mattered for understanding what I was cautious about building again. Thomas Webb and I had come west from Georgia in the spring of 1877, among the second wave of what people were calling the exodusters, families leaving the South after Reconstruction ended and the promises that came with it. We were not the first of our kind in Colorado, and not the last, and the welcome was complicated in the way that welcomes to complicated places are complicated. Sometimes warm, sometimes cold, always contingent. We had filed on the 80 acres and built a cabin and broken the first 20 acres of ground and had 2 years of genuine building before Thomas was taken by a fever in October of 1879.
I have the revised terms
He died
here.
in the house we had built together. I buried him on the east edge of the property under a cottonwood tree that drops its leaves every October in what I have chosen to believe is a considerate annual acknowledgement. I kept the farm. I kept the accounts. I kept going, because keeping going is what you do when stopping is not among the available options. 6 months after Thomas died, I met Caleb Morrison at the County Water Board meeting, where we were both objecting, for different reasons, to the same proposed change to the creek easement. We found ourselves in agreement without having intended to be, which is one of the better ways to find yourself in agreement with someone. He was widowed, I learned afterward. His wife Margaret had died 3 years before, in 1876, which meant he had been running his 120 acres alone for longer than I had been running mine. He had the specific competence of someone who has solved a practical problem many times and has stopped being surprised by the problem. We were neighbors. We were both short on time and long on work. The arrangement presented itself logically in the spring of 1880, and I wrote it down because that was how I handled things. For the first year, the arrangement was exactly what it said it was. I delivered the meals at the agreed times and collected the empty containers the following week. He maintained the fence and serviced the well and drove the posts in the northwest corner that I had been meaning to replace for a year. We were professionally punctual, we were efficiently brief at the handoff, we discussed only what was relevant to the terms. I found this satisfying in the way that a well-kept ledger is satisfying. Everything in the right column, nothing unaccounted for, no discrepancies requiring investigation. I had been running on necessity for 2.5 years, and the arrangement gave necessity a shape. I found I slept better on Tuesdays and Fridays, which were delivery days, because those were the days I had completed something that was not mine alone. I noted this without examining it and went back to work. For the first year, the arrangement was exactly what it said it was. I made the Tuesday and Friday meals. He maintained the north fence and drove the new corner posts and serviced the well. We met at the fence line at the agreed hour and exchanged the meal for a brief report on the fence work and parted. I did the mending when he presented it, with a 2-week turnaround as agreed. He did the post work when I requested it, within a reasonable time. It was, as I had intended, efficient and unambiguous. In the second year, things began to happen that were not in the contract. The first thing I noticed was the hinge. My barn door had developed a complaint, a low groan when it swung open that told me the hinge was loose. I had noted it and added it to my list of things to address when I had time, which was a list with considerable competition. I mentioned it in passing at the fence line one Tuesday, not as a request, just as one of the items in my mental inventory that came out during the brief exchange of information. Cal had nodded and said something about the weather and taken his meal and left. The following Thursday the hinge was repaired. Not by me. I had not touched it. It was done properly. The screws tightened, the hinge realigned, a small piece of new metal at the weakened point. Cal had come onto my property, which was not part of our agreement, and done something I had not asked him to do and had not mentioned it. I stood at the barn door and swung it open twice, listening to the silence where the groan had been, and I thought about this for several minutes. I said nothing. The hinge was fixed. What was I going to say? The second thing was the stew. In November of 1880, Cal had mentioned, briefly, in passing, in the way that he mentioned most things, that his late wife Margaret had made a venison stew on cold days that he still thought about. He had said this in the context of remarking on the cold, and had moved on immediately to something practical, and I had noted it the way I noted things, precisely and without visible reaction. The following Tuesday I made venison stew. I told myself it was because I had venison available and the weather had turned cold and it was a sensible meal for the season. I made it on the next cold Tuesday and the one after, and by the third one I was doing it automatically and I did not examine the automaticity. I simply made the stew and left it at the fence line and thought about other things. It was March of 1882, 2 years into the arrangement, when I finally did the accounting properly. I had been avoiding the full accounting since December, when I had noticed that Cal had arrived at the fence line on a Friday with his coat collar up against the cold, and I had added a second layer of wrapping to the Friday meal without being conscious of deciding to do it. He had not mentioned it. I had not mentioned it. But I had noticed myself doing it, and I had noted the noticing, and I had put it in the same drawer as the hinge and the stew, and had not opened the drawer. In March, the drawer had become full enough that not opening it was itself a decision, and I decided instead to take out everything and look at it clearly. I am a woman who keeps accounts. I am a woman who keeps accounts. It is the discipline that has kept the farm running and the records clear and my own life organized into something legible. I do not allow discrepancies to accumulate. So when I sat down one March evening with the arrangement paper on one side and the 2 years of actual conduct on the other and compared them, I found a list of things that were not in the contract. The hinge, a cracked window frame on the east side that had been reglazed without my asking. The stump in the north corner that had been removed over winter without any discussion. 2 lengths of fence on my side of the line that were technically my responsibility but that had been reinforced when he was working his side. On my end, the extra portions that had begun appearing in the meal deliveries sometime in the second year. The particular care I had started taking with the presentation of things. The Friday meals that had begun arriving slightly later, because I had noticed Cal generally came from the north field on Fridays and was later than Tuesdays, and later meant the food was cold, so I timed it accordingly. I laid all of this out on the kitchen table like a ledger, and I looked at it for a long time. The contract said 2 meals per week. The contract said mending with 2-week turnaround. The contract said fence maintenance and post-work and well servicing. The contract did not say fix the things she mentions in passing without being asked. The contract did not say think about what her late husband taught her about documentation. The contract did not say make the stew on Tuesdays because he said he still thinks about it. I had a very clear record of what we had agreed to. I had an equally clear record of what we were actually doing. The question I sat with for 3 evenings in March was this: if I named what we were actually doing, it would stop being the arrangement. It would become something else. Something that required a different conversation, a different kind of risk, a different paper with different terms. And the arrangement, as it was, worked. It worked efficiently and with mutual benefit and without requiring either of us to say anything about what it had become. I am a practical woman. I had been a practical woman for 45 years and had found it generally reliable. The practical answer was to leave the arrangement as it was. I nearly did. It was a Tuesday in April when Cal arrived at the fence line 20 minutes early. This was unusual. He was punctual to within 5 minutes, consistently, which I had tracked without meaning to. I was not yet at the fence with the meal. I was still at the stove. I looked out the window and I saw him standing at the fence in the April morning with something in his hand that was not his fence tools. It was a piece of paper. I finished the stew, I put it in the covered pot, and I carried it to the fence line and I set it on the post and I looked at him. He said, "I want to renegotiate the terms." I said, "Which terms?" He said, "All of them." He held the paper out. I looked at it without taking it. It was a single page in his handwriting, which was slower and more deliberate than mine, but no less precise. He had written out new terms. I read them without touching the paper, which he held at a height that made reading possible. The new terms were longer than the original. They covered the practical elements, meals, fence work, well service, with the same specificity as before, and then they covered things that had not been in the original. Things like the hinge work and the window reglazing and the stump, listed without apology as things he had done and intended to keep doing. Things like the venison stew on Tuesdays and the extra portions and the adjusted timing on Fridays, listed without comment as things he had noticed. At the bottom, in a space that was separate from the practical terms, he had written one additional clause. It was 4 words. I read them twice. I said, "You noticed the stew?" He said, "First time in November 1880. Every cold Tuesday since." I said, "And you never said anything." He said, "Neither did you." About the hinge. I looked at the paper. I looked at him. He had his wire-rimmed spectacles on his forehead in the usual way, and his large stained hands holding the paper steadily, and his full gray-streaked beard and his hazel eyes that were waiting without urgency, in the manner of a man who has written down what he wanted to say and is prepared to wait a reasonable time for the response. I said, "What does the 4th clause say?" He said, "I think you read it." I said, "I want to hear you say it." He said, "The 4th clause says I would like to renegotiate what we're calling this." I looked at the fence post between us, at the covered pot of venison stew sitting on it, at the April Colorado morning around us, the cottonwoods coming into leaf, the mountains with the last of the winter's snow, the creek running full with the snow melt. I said, "You wrote it down." He said, "I thought you'd want it in writing." He had thought I'd want it in writing. This specific thought, that I would need the writing, that I would handle it better if it were documented, that the document was how I made something real, was not in the contract. I had not told him this about myself, or not directly. But he had been paying attention for 2 years, and he knew. I stood at the fence and I understood, clearly and for the first time without looking away from it, that for 2 years we had both been paying a level of attention to each other that was not in the agreement, that the hinge and the stew and the extra portions and the adjusted Friday timing were not accidents or practicalities, but were the accumulated evidence of 2 people who had been watching each other carefully and acting on what they saw without naming it, because naming it would change the agreement. He had thought I'd want it in writing, because he had been paying attention for 2 years, and he knew that I handled things better when they were written, that the writing was how I made something real, how I confirmed it was agreed, how I could return to it later and find it unchanged. He had written it down for me. I put out my hand. He gave me the paper. I read the fourth clause again, with my own hands holding it this time. I said, "I'll need to make some adjustments to the language in the first 3 clauses." He said, "I expected that." I said, "And I'll want to add a clause of my own." He said, "I'll bring a pen next Tuesday." He picked up the covered pot. He said the stew smelled like the one Margaret used to make. He said this quietly, without sentimentality, the way a person acknowledges a true thing without making more of it than it is. I said, "The recipe is mine, but I take that as a compliment." He almost smiled. The almost smile that I had seen a dozen times in 2 years and that I had been noting in the same account where I kept the hinge and the extra portions and the adjusted Friday timing. He walked back to his property with the pot. I walked back to my house with the paper. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we had signed the original agreement 2 years before, and I read the fourth clause again. Then I got out my pen and I began drafting my additions. The first 3 clauses I revised for precision because his language was good, but mine was better, and the fourth clause I left as he had written it because it was already exactly right. I added my own 5th clause. It was also 4 words, different 4 words. I folded the paper and put it in the account book, which is where I keep things that are both practical and significant, which are the most important category of things. He came on Tuesday with the pen. We signed at the fence line this time, with the Colorado April around us and the cottonwoods making their sound in the wind and the stew on the post between us, still warm. I had made additions to the first 3 clauses, tightened the language, specified the timelines more precisely, added a clause about the barn door hinge and 3 other items he had done that were now formally included in his responsibilities, because I preferred to have done things reflected in the record. He had read my additions without complaint and had made 2 small suggestions, both of which were improvements. The 4th clause I had left as he wrote it. My 5th clause he read once and looked up at me and said nothing for a moment, which was its own kind of answer. Then he said, "You'll have to show me what that means practically." I said, "I expect the meaning will become clear over time." He said, "I can work with that. 2 signatories. No witnesses but ourselves." That was sufficient. That had always been sufficient. I am a woman who keeps accounts. The new agreement went into the account book, which is where I keep things that are both practical and significant. It is a thick book, now, after 25 years of keeping accounts and a quarter-century of things that mattered enough to write down. The new agreement is the most recent entry. I expect it will not be the last. That was the whole of it. That was everything.